Thank you very much. As mentioned, my name is Carl. I'm the undergraduate success librarian at the University of Memphis's University Libraries. And today I wanted to spend some time talking about investigating a concept that has been addressed in some academic library literature, but I think could use a little bit more. It's something that's helped me think through my place and role in the higher education environment. I want to think through a little bit about that and how I think it affects the way I think about library instruction and how we could change that. So then to give that context, this is very academic library focused and very focused on thinking about what our role as academic library workers is in the broader higher education spectrum. I'll also note, since it just came up in the session before, I'm going to be using the concept of third space in a very different way than happened in the first session today. But first, to get us in the right space of mind, I want to ask a question. So, do you feel like an academic? Why or why not? So I am, for this session, going to be using Mentimeter to get us some feedback. So I will pull that information up in a second. For right now, I'd like you to take just a minute or so to reflect on that question before I open things up to give you the opportunity to set that feedback. I'm a big fan of the reflect first, then talk. So give it just a moment to think about why you feel like an academic or not, and I will pull up our engagement features. All right, we've had about a minute to reflect on the question, so I'll give you the chance to start putting in your answers. So our first slide here is instructions that should take you to my Menti engagement. You can either go to menti.com and enter in the code, or you can scan the QR code if you would like to do this on your phone. See a few thumbs up coming in. Thank you. I will give everyone a second to do that. When we get to the actual engagement slide, there still will be the instructions for how to join at menti.com, but the QR code will go away. So I'll give us all just a moment. All right. Seen a lot of thumbs up, so let's go to the next slide and see how well this built-in PowerPoint Mentee engagement works. So the first question is just a very simple. Do you feel like an academic? Yes, no, it varies. Most people have participated who have signed on at the moment, but I'll give it just a second longer. And again, if you just joined in later, you can go to menti.com and put this code in at the top to start participating as we go into things. And as we go through here, please, add anything additional in the chat. And I'm happy to also take, discussion, conversations on mic if we want to as well. So looks like in this group, the biggest answer is it varies. 7 people who feel very confident that yes, I am an academic. 1 person who's confident, no, they're not an academic. But the majority answer is, I don't know, man, it depends. So let's add on to that. Why do you feel or not feel like an academic? Now, this should be an open response one, so you should be able to write out anything. It'll show up here. I haven't published enough yet. Some job duties are practical skills based, while others are research based. Don't write academic articles or papers, just really teach bib instruction lessons. Seem less needed after COVID. Staff, not faculty, so job classification based. Your institution doesn't think you are. Oop, didn't mean to go back. Main aesthetic marketing. Depends on the task. Not a lot of research. Not tenured like other librarians. consider yourself one, but let me see if I can scroll on this page. I not very well. Apparently, that's a downside of doing this in the PowerPoint. Oh well. But so we're getting a lot of different responses here. Some staff based on classification, things you do, clearly research, publishing seem to be academic based. Promotion, outreach, marketing. People don't think that some are being constrained by their institutions. Some of this is being comparison between others with job rank. This is all very interesting, and thank you for this. And again, if you have anything you want to add on, I do have the chat up on my other screen, so I should be able to track anything you add in there. So today, to kind of address some of these feelings and mixed sense, I'm going to go over the concept of a third space higher education professional. And I'm going to take that concept and connect it to the work we do in academic libraries and think about how this concept might affect how we think about that work we do. So I'll explain more about the actual concept in a section, but I want to talk a little bit about what my interest is and why I brought into this. I, like a number of you, have inconsistent feelings of my own sense of self as an academic and some identity issues related to my work in higher education. And this relates both to my teaching and my research. I have at different points been required to publish. My current job encourages but does not require, but it's also something where I did not have any formal research training in my library program. I did sign up for a class to do it, and then it was canceled because there was like me and one other person signed up. So I've always felt a sense of lack of confidence on that. I also felt a little weird about, the way I teach is different than the way other people on campus teach. I, with rare exception, don't get 4 credit classes. I'm invited to someone else's classroom, an experience I'm sure is very common to most of us here. And I can feel these kind of identity issues very often when I interact with academic faculty. And it's often not that I think they are looking down at me, though that's definitely happened, but I definitely feel a sense of difference and sometimes a sense of inferiority in what they do versus what I do. So this third space higher education professional concept is something I ran across in a special issue of the journal Workplace, a journal for academic labor, which is something I get email alerts for. This came out in, I believe, 2023, and I really felt an engagement with this, and it feels like it connected some of those feelings I had were helped to be explained through this concept, and it's something I've been trying to learn about and engage with more since. So let's get started with simple. What is this third space concept? So to set this up, this is built on the idea that there is a traditional binary in the work of higher education. There is academic work, the work of faculty, and non-academic work, the work of staff. And I might switch around terms a little bit here. This initial research was done in a UK concept that uses slightly different terminology that gets used in American higher education concepts. So I'm mostly trying to translate things to like faculty and staff, ways that we tend to use terms in the United States, but I might slip up a little bit. So when we look at this binary, academics, faculty have 3 parts of their job. They teach, they do research, and they do the service necessary to run the university on the academic side. Then non-academic work is everything else. It's listed as the support side of the university. And this is a mix of specialized roles, generalist staff roles, but they do the things that aren't the academic work and are very often framed in a support role and therefore a less important role than the faculty side. However, the thing about binaries is they're never quite as clear-cut as they seem. And that's where we get into the idea of third space. Third space comes from a post-colonial thought tradition that has gone back decades before it started being used in higher education, but it's an idea that there is a liminal space between the borders of binaries where things start to blur and aren't so clear cut. This makes it a site of tension as it's disrupting those binaries, but again, because it's disrupting those binaries, a possibility. Now, higher education, because it has many binaries and borders, there are many possible sites for third spaces. Now, the particular one I'm looking at is one looked at by a British academic named Celia Whitchurch, who is investigating that blurring of academic and non-academic work in the United Kingdom. Now, you note that I'm going to try and avoid, as best possible, referring to this as the third space, because there are many possible third spaces, and as mentioned, many possible third spaces in higher education. And again, this is a metaphorical concept of space, different than the idea of a third place, the not home or work, though that does sometimes also get called third space because place and space mean basically the same thing. They rhyme, the terms get used interchangeably. But here I'm talking about a metaphorical space. So then the way this kind of gets set up and is built, I'm going to pull from some earlier Whitchurch work, is if you look at the spheres of higher education, there's initially the idea that there's a clearly defined role for faculty and for staff, and never the twain shall meet. However, sometimes there are things to be done at the perimeters of their work, things that require them to collaborate together. Now, initially, this kind of collaboration is very strictly defined. Everyone still has very clear roles, and there's negotiation across those lines about you do this because you are staff, you do this because you are faculty, and it's still very clearly you can tell who's doing what in these roles. Whitchurch calls this a political process because of the way it's negotiated, that there are, very strict lines here about who does what. However, as this sort of collaboration works out, you might develop additional projects between the two that start to merge the elements between academic and non-academic, where there's work where the different roles aren't having as clearly defined lines between the work they do, and the academics might be doing some things that seem non-academic, and very importantly, the non-academics are starting to do work that seems academic in what was traditionally defined. That middle is the third space, and that is the place where third space higher educational professionals work. So this area is the project domain. So the idea that the working across these different lines are these projects. So the project domain is what the knowledge area of higher education, third space higher education professionals are. These projects exist across and outside the silos of higher education. As a result, the people who work in them have to be experts in collaboration. They're relationship builders, they're self-advocates because there's no formal structure that they're working on. They have to be able to navigate around those different structures. They get things done by building influence, by getting participation through coalitions and relationship buildings, because they can't rely on the hierarchical power structures of the university to demand that someone do something for them. You have to be a people expert. And since they can't rely on telling what to do, they have to be convincing. And these projects, since they exist outside the silos, are not owned by any individual unit within the university. Some examples of these identified in some early Whitchurch research are things like student life and welfare, widening participation, learning support, community partnership, research and business partnership, institutional research. This is not an exhaustive list, but they are often a connection between them is there things that happen that the university is trying to do that are new, that are come out of the changes in the last few decades, the financialization and neoliberalization of higher education, where some of the traditional stability and sources of state funding went away. And instead they're trying to do new things to pull in new students to try and increase tuition, new sources of community and state funding. Also similar between a lot of these is they're connected with the idea of academic unbundling. The idea that, we mentioned earlier, there were the three firm areas of academic work: teaching, research, and service. Academic unbundling is the concept that in recent decades, some of those things are not as tied to each other as they used to be. It used to be a faculty member would do all three, but now there are faculty that only focus on research or instruction. And parts of those roles have been taken on by either specialized faculty or by staff. And often some of these people doing these work in the third space projects are taking on some of these unbundled roles. And in general, the people taking on these roles, whether they're faculty or staff status, are in a more precarious role in the university than the traditional tenured faculty that they replaced in. They also look different. If we think of the image of the traditional tenured faculty member as white and male, a lot of the roles taking on in third space in these unbundled roles are more likely to be women, are more likely to be racial minorities, and all of these things intertangle with the changes in power and precarity coming with this. Now, and there also for the concept, there are two types of third space higher education professionals Celia Whitchurch identified in her literature. There are those that are unbounded. So they'll start with people who were hired into a traditional role within the binary, very clear staff role, a very clear faculty role. But because of the work they were trying to do to accomplish these projects, to get what is asked of them by the university, they find themselves going beyond those binaries into these third space projects, developing these additional relationships and taking on job duties that fit outside of what their classification would seem to just, prescribe for them. So these are not necessarily intentionally cultivated third space roles by the campus administration. On the other hand, there are blended professionals where the university is intentionally hiring a role and structuring a job duties that blends academic and not traditional academic and non-academic work. That this is a very intentional cultivation of the third space by the campus administration. And as a result, often these are housed in new organizational structures so that they might have more of a sense of place in the hierarchy than the other third space professionals who broke their own roles. Now, this is then contrasted with the non-third space, professionals on campus who either don't regularly engage outside of their own unit, or when they do, only do so in the kind of political, transactional, negotiated way that I mentioned earlier on the spheres section. Also notice that just because someone is faculty doesn't also mean they are not a third space higher education professional. Early work on this, starting with Whitchurch, was focusing on those without academic appointments. But as, decades have gone on, they start to build to see how faculty and academic roles can operate in the third space. In general, faculty in less prestigious roles are more likely to work in third space. If you think about the way that, the university structures prestige, things that are looked at as support disciplines that are skill building, such as composition, communication, mathematics, things that are just trying to teach students things to make them support ready for other, disciplines, tend to be in third space roles. Since teaching is less prestigious than research, teaching focus roles are more likely to end up working in third space. And generally, those who are contingent faculty are more likely to be asked to do third space work. Though there can be, tenured, that does not mean tenured traditional faculty don't engage in third space. And with the way that academic unbundling has worked, those traditional faculty do often have to engage with third space professionals who have taken on some aspect of traditional academic work, whether it relates to their research, like grants administration, data management, or their teaching lines like the instructional designers, technology trainers, things like that. So what is it like living and working as a third space higher education professional? There are, benefits and drawbacks. Generally, the benefits relate to, a little bit freedom from the constraints of the institutional hierarchy. You have the ability to accomplish what others can't. You can kind of try and negotiate for anything. You also have opportunity to develop a wider net of relationships across campus that goes across silos that can be very fulfilling and desirable. On the other hand, if everything is always negotiable, you might not have a clear model of how to do your work. You might have some confusion about your role and identity issues that come from that. The imposter syndrome is definitely a risk and outcome from doing third space work. You have a risk of isolation because if you can't convince others to do what you're doing, those relationships don't form and you have a hard time doing your work. There can also be resentment in that, since, faculty, if you're doing unbundled work, might be looking at it as you doing what is their work, so they perceive you as intruding. On the other hand, you have a lesser status, fewer protections, and you might be doing work that faculty think as lesser, things that they didn't want to do. So they might be unhappy at you because you're doing their work. On the other hand, they might look down on you because you're doing lesser work. It's basically all a double-edged sword. The benefits, the freedom, the relationship building are all mirrored by the risks, the role confusion, and the possible isolation. So that is my quick overview of the third space concept. So I want to ask you, what about this concept connects with your own experiences and what does not? Like before, I'm going to give you just about a minute to reflect, and then I will pull up the Mentimeter slide for you to actually submit your response. Now that we've had some reflection time, let's go ahead and pull this up. So what about the concept does or does not connect with your experience? If you kept the Mentimeter open on your device, it should have changed to this question. If not, you can again join at menti.com and use the code. This is another open response one. Connection and cross collaboration. Librarians are more able to see genuine student needs rather than narrow ideas of what faculty is supposed to do. Faculty are awesome about treating college, even though we're staff, but that has not been a universal experience in previous institutions. Ah, so you are library faculty, but because you don't teach the classes the way other faculty do, you feel compelled to say considered faculty rather than I am faculty. It's interesting. I've kind of done the same where I often say I have faculty status rather than I am faculty. Connecting with the unclear role. Oh, yeah, the Boyer's model of scholarship application engagement. I can't recall which one across that, but one of the articles I read did make the connection to this model of scholarship. Should write that down and try and engage that a little bit more. Thank you for that. Definitely connect because your non-faculty library at a research center. Oh, I need to stop trying to scroll down. There we go. There, anyway, I can see more using this. I think I've hit for that constant push to find common ground collaborative projects. Feel free if anyone wants to engage, elaborate on anything they feel in the chat or unmute themselves and kind of talk about their own feelings since This seems to be, I should have gotten someone to test this with me. This is
But
what happens when you have interesting ideas and don't test them.
but now you'll never forget it, Carl.
Let's see, click to group responses. That, nope, that didn't work. But so definitely seeing some level of engagement and connection, which I appreciate. So now I'm going to move over and take just a moment since we're kind of gotten through the initial part of the session before I turn to talking about and really explicitly applying this to libraries. Do you have any questions at this point that you would like me to answer? Or anything you'd like me to try and elaborate on? I don't see anything coming in. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. If you have any questions that come up, please drop them in the chat. So now I want to think really more specifically how this third space framework fits within the work that happens in academic libraries. So to start with this, I am going to look at some existing scholarship that does already make those connections. So I am definitely not claiming to be the first one to make this connection. This already exists out there already, and I would like to start with this to then expand upon it. So I'm going to look at this in two ways. First, I'm going to look at research that brings up libraries or library work that were not written by library workers or library information science researchers or published in library and information science journals. And I am not promising that I have done a completely thorough literature review. This is just what I've come across these 6 studies. So in this case of these, they generally do connect library work to third space when it comes up. An exception to that is the Ackerman 2020 article, which instead drew a connection between librarians and traditional specialist staff, so not working in the third space. However, even though the rest kind of did make an engagement here, it's mostly only brief. Kind of mentioned a one-off, one time kind of a side reference. The only one that I can recall that engaged with library instruction work at all was an early Whitchurch article where she is, looking at the response from a non-library academic manager who just mentions library instruction as an example as something that doesn't need to be taught by an academic or a non-academic. And that's the extent of the engagement. The big exception to this is the Velis et al. Study, which engages much more deeply with library work in third space. They note in there that academic librarians work at the, quote, intersection of professional and academic spheres, and they spend a lot of time engaging with uh, academic library research on collaboration because they find it an interesting exception. They note that in most higher education research, there's not a heavy examination of the collaborations across different professional administrative boundaries, such as academic and professional staff collaborations, with the notable exception of academic library literature that expends a lot of time on it. They spend a lot of time looking at the lessons of that and using it as a model. To note that academic librarians have been looking at these kind of relationships in a way that others on campus don't do. Now we'll look at the 8 studies I found that used the third space framework that were written by library workers, by library and information science researchers, or published in library and information science journals. And looking at some frameworks, a lot of them looking at this tend to use this framework when engaging library roles as they relate to connections with information technology and the research management infrastructure of the university. In fact, one goes so far back, Ferguson and Metz from 2023, that they're actually using the third space concept in the same kind of post-colonial, merge liminal space between binaries that actually comes out 1 year before the earliest Celia Whitchurch use of that term. So libraries have been kind of noticing this so long that it actually pre-exists the current discussion on it. The other major area that it tends to come up in is looking at the status, job classification, structural positions of libraries and library workers. Like, for example, the Liban Lodge looks at, uses third space to investigate, job classification and tenure status of academic librarians to see how we fit there. Long 2019 was interesting because it would look at collaborations, third space to describe connections between librarians and student affairs professionals on programming and outreach to increase student success, which is the kind of most in-depth and instruction related one that I have found. Greenwood is about instruction identity and was really hopeful because they brought it up, but it's a very limited engagement. Greenwood only spends one paragraph talking about the third space concept, so it's very, lightly engaged there. And I really feel like there is more that we can look at for this concept for academic library work in general and specifically academic library instruction. And, because part of why this engaged with me is that academic library work has always blurred lines. You know, Academic librarianship has been a profession for over 100 years, and yet the universities still don't know how to categorize us, how to define what we do, and that probably says something. We can be faculty or staff, as we saw for participations here. And even if you are faculty, there's very inconsistency where there were tenure track, non-tenure, what type of non-tenure track classification we fall in. I am a clinical faculty member because it seemed close enough, and they didn't want to make a separate librarian track, which is often how a lot of institutions get around trying to deal with what academic librarians are as faculty. I've also seen a lot of academic librarian roles that are in semi-faculty, near faculty. You're like, faculty status except for this one difference type of classifications as well, which again seems to be very much blurring that line. And similar to the work that we talked about for third space higher education professionals, often on campus, academic librarians' work is seen as support rather than traditional academic work, even if we're doing faculty roles, that we are, seeing things that don't quite fit the framework. You see that in our often tendency to substitute librarianship for teaching in faculty evaluations, promotion and tenure dossiers, that campus doesn't quite see what we do as traditional, faculty teaching and traditional faculty work. I also want to think maybe helpful go for this rather than keep going theoretical here is what I engaged with on this and how I saw my own work as engaging in third space and why this framework drew to me as, for something that described my own experiences and my own work. So to do that, I want to think about for a moment for information literacy as a third space project. So I am an instruction librarian and an undergraduate success librarian. So a lot of what I'm looking at here relates to what is my faculty quote unquote teaching role. So some of this connects to some of the projects I've tried to put together as the undergraduate success librarian, starting with our Tigers Write and Tigers Speak series. This was something we did to try and increase engagement for undergraduate students with the library and with information literacy. But how it developed became something that was not really a library-focused program. Instead, it's a collaboration between the libraries, but also our writing and communication center, and two departments specifically, the Department of English for Tigers Write and the Department of Communication and Film for Tigers Speak. And the way these events run, we've changed the locations. The last few have been in our main library, McWhirter Library, but they're designed to fuse information literacy and writing skills or communication skills together so that they're not prioritized or separatized, but are seen as one part of a continuous process. So students come in, they go to a series of tables that look at different parts of the writing or communication process, of which, library research and information literacy is one part. The majority of the people they talk with that are either going to be tutors from our writing and communication service or members of the other departments, very often non-tenure track faculty or graduate assistants, but they also see librarians there. The series is not really owned by any one of these departments. It's kind of an equal collaboration across all of them. And any of them kind of work that would be, any of them falling out would drastically change what these are. We're also at the University of Memphis been putting a lot of effort into developing information literacy modules that are designed to go directly into our learning management system, Canvas, using Canvas's Canvas Commons kind of open repository. So this was a replacement of our old LibWizard tutorials, which were library branded and very much existed on library owned space. And if faculty wanted their students to use them, they had to link out to them. Instead, these are designed to be directly incorporated into faculty's own learning, course shells and be weaved more directly into their instruction. So asking them to take on information literacy as part of an explicit part of their course that isn't set aside and separate. And instead, we're just kind of taking on an unbundled role for them. We're designing some of their modules for them, but they're Creative Commons licensed. So if they want to tailor and adjust them, they're free to do that as well. And some of those modules have the Tigers Write, Tigers Speak branding on them. So those were created not just by librarians, but in collaboration with the writing and communication services and are directly trying to fuse composition and information literacy concepts or oral communication and information literacy concepts. And finally, we're in the process of doing an information literacy faculty development program where we were going to do the train the trainer model, try to intentionally teach faculty how to incorporate information literacy into their own disciplinary instruction and have us take on the role of instructional developers, which is a area that tends to come up a lot of instructional design third space researchers out there. Instructional designers very often recognize themselves as taking on a third space role because they've taken an unbundled part of the teaching process and done it as well. So when I engage in these sort of things, I do kind of think of myself now as an unbounded higher education professional. I was hired into a position within the university libraries that had a very defined role, but I found it more successful to try and build these sort of collaborative relationships and blur the lines between some of these departments than to follow things strictly as it was given out to me in my initial job description. So we're back on to the conversation piece. So again, I would like you to think about what kinds of third space projects do you think academic libraries participate in? This can be things that you see happening in your own library, but also things as you look across at, conference sessions in the library literature, library social media. What things do you see people doing that seem to be blurring these lines between traditional binaries between academic and non-academic? Again, that is a Mentimeter one, so you should be able to start submitting things as it goes. So mentoring research, information literacy instruction, supporting student mental health and whole student support. Ooh, I'm not familiar with object-based learning, so I'd be interested if someone would want to expand upon that in the chat or come up, engaging in resource fairs, orientations, lecture series, and other events and programming. Again, also doing tutorial work. Again, connected to the student support and mental health, providing safe spaces, final stress relief, other train the trainer projects, to a student research showcase, synchronous work. Also, what else doing Canvas, talking about Canvas modules, holistic programming, technology access, maybe doing a word cloud was not the easiest way for me to keep track of all these responses as they come in, but I think we've got a very interesting mix of things coming up here. Outreach. Thank you all for that. Finally, for our last section before we get to the end, want to think more specifically of how we might rethink academic library instruction as a third space project. And the process of doing that would be moving information literacy from something library focused to something with a cross-campus focus. And some of the problems we engage with that is not being library problems, but it's something we take part in, something broader, and also something that would help build solidarity across campus between those who experiences the same kind of things we do as third space workers. So we're thinking about treating information literacy as a third space project. This would require a change from being the academic library as being the focal point, as being the owner of information literacy, to being an equal collaborator with academic faculty and others on this project. Now, this is an idea that even though I'm making connections to it with third space before here, is something that already is kind of percolated up in different places before that, information literacy must become something a little bit more shared. See this Cohen Article 2013, information literacy must, like so many other library services, enter the educational commons in the sense of a collaborative network of pedagogies and practices that cross internal and external institutional boundaries and has no, quote, home because it lives in no one place. That sounds very third space to me. And you can already see trends happening in academic libraries like information literacy development, that train the trainer model that is moving towards treating information literacy as a shared project, even if we're not necessarily using third space as a term. So what third space does is gives us a model and a name for what we're doing and positions it within other trends of higher education and in connection to these other projects. Would also require changing how we collaborate with academic faculty on information literacy as a project. A lot of what we have done in the past relates to what we might call those transactional collaborations, what Whitchurch calls the political relationships. We have defined roles and spaces and negotiate, I will do this for you, you will do this for me, but we're not really collaborating in a equal manner. Instead, this kind of collaboration will need to become more holistic on information literacy so that we're all working together without this being who's defined what roles necessarily. Now, that's going to be hard. We are working from an environment where academic faculty, if you look at Fagan et al.'s review of perceptions on academic faculty's views on libraries and library work, there is a growing appreciation for library instruction and what we do, but those faculty don't necessarily fully understand what information literacy is, what the roles we do, or value some of the newer things we're doing. So we're going to have to navigate the kind of those issues, which is something shared among all third space work. Navigating these power and prestige dynamics isn't just something that we do trying to convince people to see the important information literacy. It's what all third space workers do in their projects. And so we're going to rely on look at what they've done as a model for how to do that, as a way to kind of share what we've learned about how to do that. And it frames our problems as something wider happening on campus. But in the end, as we navigate that, We're going to have to kind of not accept those transactional relationships anymore and not say yes to collaborations that don't meet the goal of developing the information literacy third space project. So also change and expand the way that we collaborate with staff on information literacy. So if we're making this a third space project, it's not merely something that's only for the academic faculty and for the library. We need to bring in other staff elsewhere. I mentioned as an example earlier that we, work with our writing and communication center on this instruction. We've also worked with instructional designers on our campus, which are housed within the library, but very much feel like a separate institution. But you teach us how to do this. We need to build relationships with student affairs and success professionals to bring them into seeing the value of the information literacy third space project. And connected with this staff, a lot of these other people are already engaged in third space projects, have experiences that relate to those we work on, those, and we can build a sense of solidarity and camaraderie as we understand, as we learn from each other, dealing with these kind of experiences. And finally, dealing with recognition for the project. Note that, talked a bit about how university has different levels of prestige and what they value, and the kind of, generally the kind of applied work that would come out of the third space project and things like information literacy development are not as valued as highly as theoretical outputs. There's been a note in the literature that third space work, because there's relationship and collaboration based, is something that institutions often struggle to credit. There's not necessarily a concrete object built that can be recognized, and relationship work, while important, isn't often valued as much. But ultimately, and this is something that's come up repeatedly in literature for, information literacy assessment, we don't see the actual always see the actual objects that are the results of our work, the development of student research and their own knowledge production. And we need these collaborative partners like academic faculty to be able to see the holistic way that information literacy has been implemented. So my last little piece of reflection engagement, I ask, how would thinking about information literacy instruction as a third space project change how you approach it? Your time to reflect, but I will also go ahead and pull up the Mentimeter again for you to start putting in answers as you think of them. More collaboration with faculty. Seeking more buy-in and support from upper administration on this project. Fewer one-shots, more purposeful collaboration. I like that. Looking for opportunities for collaboration outside the library. If it's something that's important enough to stand on its own, it does not need to be folded into regular one-shots. Information literacy for life, unless here's how you deal with the specific and narrow requirements of this research assignment. Yeah. The project, the goal of itself is something that goes beyond like, here, I'm going to teach you how to do this particular assignment. Teamwork as a cohesive unit. Extensive research that went into sharing the extensive research that went into planning. Give it a moment in case anyone else thinking of it as existing at the intersection of multiple workers, agents, writing center folks, instructional designers. Nope, Ooh, I can actually click them and make that work. Okay, great. Now I can actually see the rest. It would have been lovely if I had figured this out maybe, 40 minutes ago, but we'll take it now. Encouraging multiple collaborations. Thank you. I don't see anything else coming in, so we'll go ahead and round into the end here. I've got multiple pages worth of sources, which I am going to skip through here just to take you to the fact that if you're interested in learning more, I have put together a Zotero group library that has a list of the sources I looked at today, plus some other aspects of third space research that did not really fit this particular presentation. This is an open group, so if you're using Zotero, if you find anything else more that you think would be interesting, please go ahead and add it. And put at least the back stem of it. So if you want to copy and paste it in, you can access it that way. This is my contact information if you'd like to talk with me more about this. But we're at the end. I'm going to turn it to just general Q&A. I do have, still using Menti for that, but also I will happily take questions in the chat. Or if you would like to unmute yourself or raise your hand, I see Morgan has his hand up, so please go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Carl. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. This is a really interesting presentation. Thank you for it. I came in a few minutes late, so I was wondering, I may have missed it or I didn't know if you addressed, how are you seeing the idea of third space overall as when you consider faculty status for librarians, are you thinking of it more as threat or opportunity? And the reason for the premise of the question is a little bit, I'll just give a real brief context for where I sit. I'm a director of a of a community college library, and my peers that all report to the same AVP are the director of the tutoring center, the director of the faculty center for teaching and learning, the director for our distance learning program, which has all of our instructional designers. All of these folks are professional staff, not faculty. I'm the only one that has a department with faculty in it for the librarians. I myself am not considered faculty administrator, but they are faculty librarians. And I guess as I listen to your presentation, I'm thinking to myself, boy, a lot of those other folks have a lot of same thirds, and you brought it out yourself, and some of the comments have brought it out as well. A lot of those instructional designers, writing center, staff, others are certainly in that same third space in terms of work, like we are, same mindset, right? Same interactions with disciplined faculty and other staff. Having said, I mean, I guess that's my underlying question. Does putting us in the third place, alongside colleagues of that nature who have emerged at the institution as staff, right? They never were grandfathered in.
Right.
They never had we kind of had the legacy of already being faculty and have carried that with us. Does that, having us all together, does that pose a problem for an administrator to say, wait, they're all kind of doing the same thing. Why aren't they all staff? You know what I'm saying? I'm highly defensive of the faculty position. Don't get me wrong. I want that for the librarians, but I'm worried about that perception. Does that make sense?
I think that's a reasonable worry to have. And I think even without thinking of us explicitly this, what I've understood from the literature, that has been the trend for fewer tenure track faculty positions for libraries and fewer faculty classification positions for libraries over the past few academic librarians for the past few decades. I think, there's certainly a sense of risk there, but, and I'm probably a little bit of a radical when it comes to thinking of higher education structures and positions. My sense would be if we see ourselves commonality there, then it can be our space in solidarity with them to try and work with them to get more protections, to advocate for them, for everyone to have the kind of same protections on campus. That if they're doing work that is academic connected, They deserve that. And frankly, again, I think every worker on a higher education campus needs better job securities, and everyone should have the right to, an assumption that they're not going to get fired this year, that they should have the safety to speak out and talk about their job roles. Even if it's not academic work, and just, academic freedom is important rationalization for why we have those protections, but those protections have never been sufficiently and equitably distributed across campus, and it should be our role to advocate for that, for those whose positions developed, later in a way that they were not thought of as faculty. So it's a threat. It's also an opportunity, going in with the same kind of stuff we talked about in third space. Thank you for the question. I don't see anything, questions come to Menti, but does anyone else have something like to share? Please raise your hand, plop it into the chat. But if not, I'm more than happy to let the Eastern time zone folks actually get to their lunch at a normal time rather than in 15, 20 minutes.